That's actually a transition, I think, to the next block about how these are translating into the funding questions, because Ilhan Omar did invoke yesterday what Max Miller said on the floor and said, how dare you censure Rashida Tlaib when nobody has said a word about Max Miller claiming we're going to turn Gaza into a parking lot. And yeah, we can put, we're about to play some clips of a bitter fight that broke out on the Senate yesterday that did not get a lot of attention, but is super instructive because Republicans are trying to separate aid to Israel from aid to Ukraine.
And the context for this is a wild statement from out of Ukraine from President Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't even want to set it up. Let's just play this clip from President Zelensky.
If you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit and we will give you back money.
Okay, the idea.
This is like your uncle at Thanksgiving.
Like, please, the idea that Ukraine would wage a stalemated at best war, on credit, which they would then presumably pay back by selling off what remaining state assets they've held on to since the collapse of the Soviet Union, sounds like the worst possible deal for regular Ukrainians that you could possibly conjure up.
Absolutely.
And people say, well, what's the alternative? That Russia conquers the entire thing? No, that's not the alternative. The alternative is a ceasefire and you enter into negotiations.
Yeah.
Which was what should have happened, in the very beginning.
Yeah, I was thinking
under better conditions.
No, I was thinking this week actually about something you said a couple years ago, or I think maybe you said it a year ago about peace negotiations that had been scuttled, and I think at the time it was Naftali Bennett who had broken some information about the West America scuttling peace negotiations in Ukraine that even Zelensky had been open to, and then looking back and looking at we have a hard time knowing the death tolls, but even in that wonderful Time magazine piece, and I say wonderful because it was so insightful in a way that I don't think the Beltway wanted it to be into the war, some estimates of 100,000 casualties at least on each side of this. How many of those could have been avoided if the peace negotiations hadn't been scuttled? And how many, if we're going to talk about this a year from now and peace negotiations start in earnest, could have been avoided or could be avoided in the next year if we finally recognize that this is a stalemate? So in the Senate, Republicans tried to divorce the Ukraine aid from the Israel aid. They're also trying to tie it to a border bill that, from my perspective, we probably disagree on this. It deals a lot with asylum. It deals with funding to a wall. But I think probably the biggest thing in the bill is asylum. It was part of a bill that was passed by the House recently. That is something they're also trying to tie to the Israel funding, to Ukraine funding. They're trying to bring it all together. This came to a head yesterday with Jeanne Shaheen, Chris Van Hollen, Democrats in the Senate freaking out. And Roger Marshall and J.D. Vance kind of giving it back to them. So let's play this mashup of Democrats in the Senate yesterday.
We, the United States, must support our friends and democracies that are under attack from brutal adversaries. That means ensuring that Israel has the right to defend itself in the aftermath of the brutal October 7th attack of Hamas. It also means ensuring that the people of Ukraine can defend themselves against Putin's rank aggression. This proposal on the floor today is tantamount to surrendering to Putin's aggression. This is waving the white flag. All of us were gathered in the old Senate chamber, most of us, recently when President Zelensky addressed the United States Senate. President Zelensky was very clear that the Ukrainians would continue to fight on no matter what. But he was equally clear that without the support of the United States and our allies, Putin has the upper hand.
The Ukrainian people are not only defending their land and freedom, they're fighting for the preservation of liberal democracies around the world. What some of my colleagues overlook in their singular campaign in support of Israel is just how closely the fate of Ukraine and Israel are tied together. And there's one country which links both of those countries together. That country is Iran.
I'm sorry, but that is insane. Let's hear from Senator Vance, who is responding to this.
Colleagues may forget that a matter of weeks ago, a matter of months ago, there were people in this chamber, there were people in the United States of America demanding that the state of Israel give money and weapons to the Ukrainians, money and weapons that the Israelis are now using this very moment to defend themselves. The idea that these policies are not in tension with one another, the idea that what happens in Russia and Ukraine is separate from what happens in Israel is not just obvious, it is common sense, and it has been borne out by the reality of the last couple of weeks. Now, my colleagues would like to collapse these packages. Too many of my colleagues would like to collapse these packages because they would like to use Israel as a political fig leaf for the president's Ukraine policy. But the president's Ukraine policy, just like the Israeli policy, should be debated. We should talk about it. We should discuss it. We should separate the costs and benefits and analyze them as distinct policies, because that is what the American people deserve of their legislature.
And they know full well what they came up with is a total non-starter. Instead of putting together common sense border policies that can pass in divided government, Senate Republicans basically copy and pasted large chunks of the House's radical H.R. 2 bill. And that's their asking price for helping Ukraine. Making Ukraine funding conditional on the hard-right border policies that can't ever pass Congress is a huge mistake by our Republican colleagues. By tying Ukraine to border, Republicans are sadly making it harder, much harder, for us to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin. It sends a terrible signal to both our friends and adversaries. It will be a moment that history will remember.
Okay, so you heard Chuck Schumer following J.D. Vance there, and to be clear, they're talking about two different things. J.D. Vance and Roger Marshall tried to vote unanimous consent yesterday on a bill the House passed last week that gives $14 billion to Israel, and it's paid for by cuts to the IRS. 12 Democrats voted for it. On the House side, that was obviously going to be very difficult for any Senate Democrats to do, but what you heard wasn't so much opposition to the IRS funding cuts. You heard from Jeanne Shaheen, and you're hearing this also from Chuck Schumer talking about the border. That is a separate initiative which says, okay, Biden, you want us to have money for both Israel and Ukraine tied together, then you're also going to make these changes to the asylum process. That argument that this is all interconnected, thus it must be funded at the same level. Ryan, what do you make of it?
And I think the reason they didn't criticize the IRS funding portion of this is because then Republicans would say, okay, fine, we'll get rid of the IRS funding and we'll just give the money to Israel, or we will find some other way to pay for this Israel funding, because it's, to your point, that's not their main objection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a non-starter. The IRS stuff is a non-starter, but their main objection is that it's not collapsed together. Mm-hmm. That they want to move Ukraine money and Israel money at the same time.
They know Israel's popular. They know Ukraine is waning in popularity. So if they can tie it to Israel, they know it has a better chance of passing.
But what's interesting is that they could probably pass both.
Probably,
like there is growing opposition to Ukraine funding in the Republican Party. There's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of opposition to it among Democrats, even on the left. Mm-hmm. And so there are enough Republicans that could probably move it through. Now they're insisting on, but I'd be curious for your take on that. You know the Republican Party better than me, but now they're insisting on tying it to these border policies. And I think Democrats would actually love to be dragged kicking and screaming towards some tough immigration policy. Yep. But not that stuff. Like there are things that they would like to have done so that the political issue is taken off the table a little bit. Yeah. Without their fingerprints being on it. Yeah. But that's not it.
It's like Republicans on abortion.
Right. And do Republicans want? I think some Republicans like the issue.
I think
they don't want to solve it.
The White House, interestingly enough, has signaled some willingness to work on potential border policies. So that's kind of an interesting negotiating chip, especially because the House is it's such a tight majority lead in the House of Representatives. And the White House knows that. They know they desperately want to get funding for both Israel and Ukraine. I think the real bargaining chip within the immigration bill, that H.R. 2 that was basically, as Chuck Schumer said, copy and pasted, is going to be DACA, is going to be asylum for people who were brought here as children. That's going to be, I think, where Republicans and Democrats might be able to find common ground if the White House actually decides to play ball on this question, which might be its best option going forward because of the way the House of Representatives is. And to your point, a lot of people on the right see Ukraine funding as Mike Johnson's big litmus test. How is he going to be a speaker? That will be determined by how he handles this question of resisting blob pressures to keep the spigot running with Ukraine. Even Kevin McCarthy was sort of further right on that than most of the Republican Party establishment. So, I mean, could they probably pass something? Yes, because even Mike Johnson and even Senate, or even House Republicans, Freedom Caucus people understand that there can be room for some Ukraine funding. It's just this keeping the spigot on to the degree that it is on with these funding levels that they're resisting. So if they come to the table, they can get something done. It might be having to come to the table on border stuff, though.
Yeah, both parties love war, so don't bet against military funding making it through.
Never
unless
bet
unless you want to lose money.
That's right.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.